I'm going to get this one of these days. Anyway, here we are tonight. Good evening, everybody. Wingane Walomwa, Nindashinzi Kike Mark Peters, and Ninunjiai Nalahi, up the river from Nahi, the Munsee-Delaware Nation. It's good to be here tonight on Sunday, November the 15th for session number 4 on YouTube Live. And something like session number 26 or 27 in a continuing series. So anyway, like I said, it's good to be here tonight. We're going to continue on with what's called the French-Indian War tonight, the first 2 years of it. I've got a bit of a plan in place for the next few sessions. I'm going to finish this French and Indian War, and then perhaps Pontiac's War as well. And then I plan to go into discussions on the day-to-day types of life things that were going on in villages and between nations and such during these times. So I might be getting to the end of the French-Indian War by the end of this month, I hope. Then probably going to take a break for December, and then back in January to continue on. So that's the plan at this point, anyway. So one of the other things I want to do is actually spend a session or two reviewing this book here. It's called The Dutch Munsee Encounter by Paul Otto. And I wish I'd had it a few months ago when I started this with respect to the 1600s and the Dutch Munsee encounter in New Amsterdam during that period. I made reference to it, but at the time I couldn't. I didn't have the text, and it's hard to find text. This is a hard copy with 222 pages. It cost me $182, and I just got it last week or a couple weeks ago. So it's hard to find, but managed to get one, and it seems to cover some of the things we weren't able to cover during that period. That some of those gaps that are out there that need to be filled. So I intend to do a session on or two on that book by itself at some point in the near future as well. So last time we ended up, we talked about the beginning of this French-Indian War, how the Munsees and Delawares had been caught in basically between a pair of scissors, as we had discussed, and as Munsees later describe also regarding the American Revolution. But if you take a look at this map, we'll look at it once more. The dark green area is the French, the orange is the British, and in between that light green area is the Munsees, Delawares, and other nations that are caught in between what's almost like a pair of scissors. That if they don't make some decisions, they're going to get cut in half. And as we discussed, the Munsees were kind of having to make a choice between the best of two evils, I suppose you could say. Last time, again, we talked about these issues, and also how George Washington, a 22-year-old lieutenant in the Virginia militia, had been assigned to go and check out the French incursions into the Ohio, and a battle at a place called Jumonville occurred. French soldiers were killed, and then soldiers were sent from Fort Duquesne to get back at Washington, and then a battle occurred at Fort Necessity, and Washington was defeated. General Braddock was sent to teach the French a lesson, but his whole army was wiped out by a couple hundred Frenchmen and 600 warriors of the Western Confederacy. So we also talked about a little bit about how, the Munsees have been treated over the past 150 or so years since the Dutch first came into New Amsterdam, and on many of the things that occurred. We also talked about, or maybe I'll talk about now if I didn't last time, that I mentioned before that the Munsees of Delawares had been kind of in this position of peacemakers since the beginning of this covenant chain with the English in the New York area in the 1660s. That position as a woman who were known as the peacemakers was an honored, respectful position that was turned into a sort of derogatory way of looking at us over time. However, we did continue to keep the peace and even make peace between nations from that time forward. And although there were many problems with the Dutch before the English came in, we actually weren't involved in starting any wars with the English or other nations after the 1660s, and we didn't need to defend ourselves similarly. And we remained a peaceful people up until the beginning of what we're getting into right now, the French-Indian War. And actually up until October 16th of 1755, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But we are talking about, this area here kind of, in a way, the Ohio River, Logstown, then up the Allegheny all the way to Kittanning, which is where many of the Delawares had been pushed to by this period in time. And as well, many areas in eastern Pennsylvania still where Munsee villages and Delaware villages were located. And you can see a number of them if you take a look on this map here. You see the Susquehanna River and the Delaware River over to the right. And you'll see a number of white villages marked with the black dots and Indian villages, mostly Delaware, with the red triangles. And these would include Munsees as well. And they go all the way up the Susquehanna to Shamokin there, you see, and then over to the right to Great Island, and then all the way up the north Susquehanna to Wyoming, and up to a place called Tioga at the top, which is in Iroquois country. But it's a Munsee or Delaware kind of town during this time. So one of the other things that is going on during this time is that the Moravian missionaries are coming into the picture. As I mentioned last time, they started coming around in the 1740s. However, by 1753, they had quite significant, they had quite a few villages actually in the area around this particular time, and I'm just going to point some of them out here. If we go to the Delaware River, Philadelphia on the right, and the Susquehanna from Harrisburg to Shamokin and Wyoming on the left. Many of these places are Moravian villages, such as Bethlehem, Nain, Nazareth, and Yalagameka, Wequatank, Janadenhutton, Shamokin, Friedenshafen. I'm not sure if they had a place at Wyoming, but Friedenshafen and Wyalusing and the Shishquaquanic, places like that, all up the Delaware, the Lehigh River mainly, and over into the Susquehanna. The Moravians have been given permission to establish these missions, these villages, and they took in people who were having tough times, basically, and needed help with various issues in their lives. And I'm going to be going over a lot of what I'm going over, actually. I've been referring to various sources over the past while. I mentioned Grumet, we've been following quite a bit, and I'm still following him now, tonight even, and a couple other dissertations I referred to last time. I'm also kind of including this book now, David Zeisberger, A Life Among the Indians by Earl Olmsted. There's a picture of David Zeisberger, a painting of him. And he was a missionary who lived and worked in this area during this time in the 1750s, and actually continued to be a missionary with the Moravians, and was responsible for moving our brothers and sisters to Moravian Town down the river from us, the Lenapewalikawit, and was a missionary there even to the late 1700s. And quite an extensive time living among the Delawares and learning many things about us as the Munsees and Delawares. So he's another missionary in addition to Heckwelder, who I've been referring to quite a bit. And, you know, these missionaries, they had their own bias, ways of being biased, and their own ethnocentric ways of looking at the world, their own religious beliefs and ways. And, you know, a lot of the things that they wrote were full of their own emotions and even exaggerations and maybe twisting of the facts even a bit here and there. But there's a lot of information if you read between the lines, and you can kind of pick up on, I think, that's pretty real and good evidence. Things they observed, for instance, and things that they heard other people say and wrote down right afterwards, or events that they recorded that occurred. Like I say, even Heckwelder, there's a lot of information in his writing that I have questions about, but there's a lot of information that I'm pretty sure is quite accurate at the same time. So Zeisberger is one of those guys as well, and like I said before, he was very biased in certain ways, and especially against the Munsees, actually. He never really had anything good to say about the Munsees, and we're going to kind of follow along with that over the next 50 or so years as we go through this. So Zeisberger, like I say, is coming around during this time, and just want to maybe make a mention of a particular mission here. There's a mission at a place called Munsee-Delaware, right in the middle here, above the town of Nazareth, kind of Munsee-Delaware, and it's a town that was established by a guy named Captain George Rex of Munsee. But the Moravians actually moved into those lands and took it over after Captain George Rex left. And by the end of 1753, they actually had about 56 members of Munsees, Delawares, and Mohicans living there, and even Nanticokes, I understand as well. And as well, they established another place called New Genadenhutton. If you see in the center there, go up the Lehigh River from Easton, and you'll see a place called Genadenhutton under Wexquatank. And they established a mission at Shamokin, which is over here on the Susquehanna as well. And they established missions all the way up to Susquehanna and Wyoming, Friedshutton, Wyalusing, and up near Tioga. So they really had themselves spread out, and there was quite a few missionaries. And they didn't start out with many members, and they never had really a lot, but they did have a steady group of people who became dedicated to them. In New Genadenhutton, they actually had Mohicans living on one side of the village, and Delawares lived on the other. And when Zeisberger came through, well, not when he came through, but yeah, when he came through Shamokin, where a number of Munsees and Delawares were still living, he talked to Paxanosa, the Shawnee chief, as well as T.D. Eskung, who we mentioned before, and a man named Abraham, who was a Mohican, who was one time a Moravian convert, but he changed his views and got back into his own traditional way of seeing things. And these were three of the head chiefs of what's known as the Valley Indians, which is the Wyoming Valley, which stretches basically from Wyoming down to Shamokin, I understand. And these men told Zeisberger during this period of time, which is in the summer of 1754, that they're still loyal to the English, but they're worried about the French coming from the west and Connecticut settlers coming from the east. So in addition to the Virginians that were trying to take these lands and possess them, and the Pennsylvanians, Massachusetts and New York. There was also Connecticut laying claims and purchasing actually some of these lands from the Six Nations. And the Munsees, so the Delawares, were very worried about the Connecticut Land Company sending in waves of settlers to take control over these lands. At the same time, Zeisberger reports a loss of crops from a late spring frost during this year, which has a significant impact on things. Because at the same time, as I mentioned before, English traders had already been driven out of the area by the French. The men I mentioned, Paxanosa, the Shawnee chief, T.D. Eskung, and Abraham, all went to Philadelphia in April 1775 to see the governor about maybe getting some support from the English in this threat by the French, but the governor tells them to go home and to wait for word from him. However, this word never came. Zeisberger also mentions that the Moravian villages were also having a hard time finding food at this time as well. And then, as I mentioned, suddenly Braddock with his great army is defeated in a matter of hours by the French and the Western Confederacy. And this has an impact on things as well. Commander Dumas, the French commander at Fort Duquesne, immediately after Braddock's defeat, sent runners to all of the local First Nations, the Indian peoples, telling them that they will drive the English into the sea. So, this is some pretty quick thinking diplomacy, I suppose you could say. After this defeat, he doesn't stop. He continues to look for allies to finish the job. They're getting quite serious here, the French. about this war. So by October 1755, Indian war parties are starting to roam the frontiers west of the Susquehanna. So that's these areas here, basically. This is the Susquehanna on the left. And these towns, these non-native towns, are starting to become targets for the Munsees and Delawares, who have decided to maybe not side with the French, but at least take advantage of the situation to show how the English, how upset they are with them. So they started raiding, like I say, in the west of the Susquehanna. And in some of these groups of warriors were actually led by French partisan soldiers dressed as Indians. And there would be 20 to 100 warriors to a group. And they weren't all just on foot. Many of them actually rode horses. And we think of the Wild West with their horses. But a lot of these men, a lot of these warriors and soldiers actually rode horses in their endeavors. And, you know, to see 100 warriors coming through the forest on horseback, I imagine that'd be a pretty scary sight. So T.D.S. Kung, who I mentioned, his name is also Gideon among the Moravians, but it means reed shaken in the wind in the Delaware. That's what his name T.D.S. Kung means. Him and his people and other Delawares and Munsees decided this time to what's called shed their petticoats and throw off their garments as women that they'd been wearing as peacemakers for the last 70 or 80 years and take up the hatchet that they haven't done in many, many decades, if not even more than a century. T.D.S. Kung was made captain by a small group of his followers at this place called Wekwatank. And that place called Wekwatank is right here on the this map somewhere. Maybe it's not on this map, but it's somewhere up the Lehigh anyway, up Hoskindakwa and the Niskapak area. That's where Wekwatank is, where T.D.S. Kung was living at the time. And in April of that year, 56 converts from the local mission left to join him in his pursuits in war. And later, 15 more of these converts leave to settle with the Nanticokes. And in the Wyoming Valley, and an interesting observation by Zeisberger rather at this time is he calls the Nanticokes, he says the Nantigo, and then he also mentions that the Munsees, the Delawares, called them Onetgo, which is very similar to Onalaktego, and I don't know what that means, but it's interesting the way Zeisberger notes what they call the Nanticokes at this particular time. And another missionary comes into the picture around this time, Frederick Christian Post. And he spoke Delaware, Mohican, and Mohawk, and he becomes a major figure as we move forward. Zeisberger notes that there's a huge food shortage again in the Wyoming Valley at this time. Early frost had killed many well, much of their crops, and there's the Wyoming Valley again up here, and I wish my cursor worked. I'm going to find out how it does that, but if you can see just where the Susquehanna River turns northeast at Wyoming, that's the Wyoming Valley in there, and it's quite a excellent area for farming. So as these things are going on, the other First Nations start to move to other areas. And some of these other areas are right here. So they're moving not only to the Allegheny and up north into the Susquehanna. And warriors are kind of using some of these towns as staging areas, but they're sending their families much further away so they don't have to be subjected to any retaliation from what's going on, I suppose you could say. So these families are sent north and west to the Allegheny, and others join other Indians already in places that Grumet talks about, at least, in places like Pompton. And this isn't the best map. If you know New Jersey, I guess you might be able to figure out where this is, but somewhere in New Jersey, it's really a horrible map. But that's the Pompton Plains. And wherever that is in New Jersey, certain native Delawares, Munsees started to move there during this time, as well as, like, some are moving east or west rather, some are moving north, but some are actually moving back east. And here's another place where Munsees are moving to, this place called Cranberry. Well, it's called Cranberry, but it's called Cranberry here, I guess. Middlesex County in New Jersey. We live in Middlesex County, Ontario here right now. But anyway, that's where Cranberry is. It's again not a very good idea of its location, but let me see if you know the area. I suppose there's Perth Amboy and other places. If you know this area, you might be able to figure it out. But I just wanted to show some idea where these places are. And then there's another place called Crosswix. Again, this might be a bit better map, where people began to move to as well. And that's where that red star is. Crosswix, just a little bit south of Trenton, New Jersey. So people are, like I said, not only just moving north and west, they're moving east as well, back towards all this settlement where their own relatives are starting to cause a lot of havoc. And some also join with the southern New Jersey Indians in that area at the time. And this is southern New Jersey, just a kind of topographical map. I have no idea where the locations are or would be in this particular area, but just to reference it. And so, like I say, these got people coming from the west and the north to attack these areas, and you've got people from these areas moving east to these areas I just mentioned, and they actually become part of what's called the Treaty of Crosswix in January of 1756. And commit their loyalty to the British Crown, while, like I say, their relatives are fighting a war against them. So, in the north, like I say, you have these. I'm going to go to this map because it seems to be one of the better ones. You have these places, and it's hard to say on this map, but if you go to Shamokin here, and up near Waken, that's up near a place called Great Island. And then if you go all the way up to the top here, there's a place called Tioga. And there's a place called Atsinasink up that way, and Chicacong, in the Chemung Valley. And then Ansaningo and Aquaga. These are towns that became staging areas for Munsee and Delaware warriors to make raids into the south and east. And this time period became known by the settlers as Shades of Death. In October of 1755, in October of 1755, Shingas and Pesquitoman and Captain Jacobs, well, actually not them, but one of Shingas's proteges and 7 other men who are named actually, and with their names given who these Delaware men were, attack the settlement of Penn's Creek. And got a map here, Penn's Creek somewhere. Okay, here it is. Penn's Creek in Pennsylvania. It's you can see the Susquehanna again on the right, and the West Branch goes up in the middle there, and then Penn's Creek is somewhere down there between the Susquehanna and the Allegheny, kind of. But this village is attacked, and it's destroyed. The people, the Delawares, burn all of the houses and take prisoners and horses. And it's said that 13 men, 1 woman, and a small child are killed. Again, it's weird how they know all the names of the Indians that were there, but they don't always know the names of all these settlers that were killed. Or at least not from what I've been able to see, because I've been looking to find out some exact numbers here and details about these sort of things. So they did some damage here, and then more Delawares and Munsees went to a place called Manahani Creek, took captives and torched the town. It's noted that 25 people were either killed or taken captive, and this is a common way that I see in the literature describing these things, is a number, and then killed or captured. It doesn't say exactly how many were killed and how many were captured. It's just that 25 were killed or captured. And the numbers get a little shady because of the way they're kind of reported here. These captives, anyway, the ones that weren't killed, and there was usually, well, not usually, it was always men that were killed. Women and children weren't killed on any type of regular basis at all. But these captives, women and children, were taken to this town we mentioned before, Katanning, on the Allegheny River here. There it is, the Allegheny, and there's Katanning. That was a captives town, and known as a captives town, where prisoners would be taken. We talked about how they weren't all treated all that bad, really. And after some of these massacres at Penns Creek and Mahoning, a man named John Harris and Alexander McKee, a man named Alexander McKee, and 40 men are sent to bury the dead at these places. And Alexander McKee is another person that starts to associate with the Munsees and Delawares at this time. And we continue to have a relationship with him until he passes away in around 1796. Also, for about another 50 years, or 40 years, actually. Just like Zeisberger. Some of these players stay in the game a long time here. And so these men, on their way to bury the dead, they meet what they call friendly Delawares at Shamokin, a place that is now a Moravian Mission. This place here over to the left, Shamokin. And the Indians at Shamokin tell these 40 men that come to do this burial and to do other things, to build a fort, I believe, as well. They tell them to go home on the east side of the river. And instead of going home on the east side of the river, they don't believe the Indians. They think they're pulling a trick on them, and they go home on the west side of the river, and they're attacked by Pisquatoman and 120 Delawares, and serious damage occurs there. And because of this, the friendly Delawares at Shamokin realize that the English don't trust them either, and it's just another reason why they as well start to lean towards not liking the English and not joining the French perhaps, but at least, like I say, using these circumstances to maybe try and get some of their land back. So at this time, after this attack, all the native people, all the Delawares at Shamokin, move up towards Wyoming to a town called Muskopek. And the vice regent of the area, sent by the Onondaga Council, Oneida named Shikellamy, doesn't like that we're doing these things without any permission, and complains a bit. And he's got a son named James Peters and a son named James Logan, and they don't like this because they want to stay close to the white people, apparently. But I'm interested in this son named James Peters, and this name starts to come into the picture as well. But anyway, T.D. Uskung, around this time, becomes known as a war captain, and he and his people start to attack the area of Minisink and other areas where their lands were stolen. So the area of Minisink is, we've talked about it before, but it is basically eastern Pennsylvania, along the Delaware River here. At the area called Easton, basically, or Hunter Settlement, or Clistowak in Delaware. That's the Minisink area that T.D.S. Gung and his followers were originally from, apparently. So they then, like I say, at the same time, there were other killings in Pohokapo Creek where 6 were killed. And in December 22 of 1755, it's determined that 89 settlers had been killed in Stroudsburg and 40 homes destroyed. As well, 20 militiamen had been killed on the Lehigh in a rather significant battle. So, there's sort of a mention that all we did was attack defensive settlers, but there's quite a few battles with militia and large groups of armed men as well. So it's not quite, again, like the stereotypes portray things as. So, got 20 more minutes here. I say T.D.S. Gung and his people started attacking in the Minisink area. And Delawares and Shawnees attack the county of Berks. And rumors of a large force of French and Indians start circulating, that they're on the way. And also rumors that the French would restore the Delaware lands if they joined in this battle with them. And the frontiers began to become cleared of settlers around this time because of these warrior raids on the settlements. Scotch-Irish settlements in Fulton and Franklin counties were attacked, also along the Maryland borders. Swatara Creek and Topahokan Creek. And there wasn't an army in Pennsylvania at this time. The Quakers had some influence, and they were pacifists and wouldn't agree to having an army. But Benjamin Franklin kind of comes into the picture at this time as well, and starts to make efforts to make sure a militia gets developed because of the threat on the frontiers. There's many numbers that seem to be floating around in various texts about how many settlers were killed and taken captive and all these different things. I've seen 700 people killed and taken captive in one reference. Makes you think that there's almost all of them were killed and a couple were taken captive or something, but that's not the way it was. And other references where 200 people were killed and 200 taken captive during this war. So I'm not sure about what the numbers are. I'd say probably, not as many as the numbers that seem to be used in the texts I've been reading. They seem to be all quite exaggerated. And there's a lot of exaggeration on other aspects of this as well. But at the same time that these raids were going on, vigilante groups that had always been around, even long before this, and doing damage to the Delawares and Munsees, they were now gaining more, courage and taking matters into their own hands. And they murdered a family of Indians at a place called Walden in New York. And I think I've got a picture of where that is here. Maybe not. Anyway, a place called Walden, New York. And a place called Piapac, where a family was slaughtered in their wigwam. So this is the Piapac area. again, in these areas where these were friendly Delawares who had made a treaty with the English to be loyal, and yet they're being hunted down by these vigilante groups. Sorry, but there's another place called Walden in there. And Grumet notes that outrageous atrocities and ranting threats silenced voices of moderation and confirmed the worst stereotypes on both sides, I suppose. As I mentioned, colonists called this time shades of death. And as these vigilante groups started to threaten the friendly Delawares in New York and New Jersey, people started to move in at this place called Stockbridge in Massachusetts. And I believe I have here somewhere as well. Get a little caught up in these maps here sometimes. Anyway, I don't have it on here, but there's a place called Stockbridge in Massachusetts where people started to go to, as well as to the Catskill areas in the northern part of the Hudson, where people started to move to when their things weren't going too well in the east. While all these things are going on, the missionaries were sending regular communications to the governor from these settlements that they were the Moravian settlements that they had. They were kind of like spies, I guess you could say. They weren't necessarily on our side. Well, they weren't on our side, actually. They were on the side of their communities, but they seemed to be on the side more of the English than they were with us, and passed information about our comings and goings to officials in Pennsylvania. And as we go down the road here over the next few decades, many other cases and situations as well. So like I say, there's good things about what the Moravians did. There's also some questionable things about how they did it, I suppose you could say. Paxinoza and Abraham this is kind of one of those day-to-day or unnoticed things. Paxinoza, the Shawnee chief, and Abraham, the leader of the Mohicans, made their best efforts to protect this blacksmith that was located in Shamokin. Again, there was good people, and he was apparently one of these types of people. And they made efforts to make sure he could get out of Shamokin when all these bad things started to occur. And then Shikellamy, the Oneida vice regent, took him from them and made sure he made it all the way to Bethlehem where he could be safe. So these guys are all working together to make sure this white blacksmith is not hurt. And there's many instances of these kinds of things occurring. Like I say, they were good people, and they weren't hurt, and they were protected significantly. By November, however, the French, that's November 1755, the French were in control of the Wyoming Valley. The Bethlehem streets, as I had mentioned in one of these maps here, the Bethlehem streets were filled with militia who had been sent to stop the Moravian Indians from doing any further damage. And here's the town of Bethlehem right in the middle here, again, just east or west of this town called Easton. And And it's at the same time, if you go up the Lehigh River from Easton to a place called Janaden-Hutton, at that place, at this time, on November the 24th, 1755, it looks like about 9 of the Moravian missionaries and their wives, a couple of wives, I believe, even were killed. And Zeisberger says here that it was by 12 warriors led by a Captain Jacobus, who was a Munsee from Assinissink. And they killed, I think, 9 of the Moravian missionaries, or it's like 7 and 2 of their wives, I think, a few. And like I say, this happened at Janaden-Hutton. Another massacre happens at another Janaden-Hutton in 1784, if we ever get there. But this Captain Jacobus is from this area up here near Tioga, and there's a town called Assinissink up there, where Zeisberger says he is from. And as I mentioned, people here in the town, in the community I'm talking from right now, told Heckwelder in the 1780s that we had originally had once lived in Assinissink and the Chemung area, which is this area here, Wyalusing and Tioga. So again, we are just getting ourselves connected from here to there through some of these facts, and we might have some relation to Captain Jacobus. And why this happened, it's hard to say. I need to look further into it, and if it was by Munsees, again, I can't be positive, but apparently, according to Zeisberger, it was. Anyway, captives were taken up to the Assinissink and Tioga area, as well as Katanning. And Zeisberger notes that there were basically 3 waves of settlement in the Pennsylvania area of settlers. There was sort of the new settlers in the western part, in the Susquehanna area. There was a middle, well, let's just talk about Zeisberger's observations here. He says there were 3 belts of white occupation between the Indian territories and the more populous eastern areas. And he describes these further outposts of settlers in the Susquehanna area. On the frontier, he described their buildings as crude huts, that they were wild and graceless souls, and many were outcasts evading the law. They grew no crops for the first years and detested plodding employment. So this is the belt along the Susquehanna of settlers. There's another one about 25 miles east of what Zeisberger calls log cabin dwellers with cattle, sheep, horses, and hogs. And another 50 miles east, probably here in the Delaware River area, of pioneer farms with large families who grubbed a meager existence. And these people in the further east would have been like the crude hut dwellers that were now on the Susquehanna at one time, until they had time to further develop the lands that they pretty well got for nothing at our expense, I guess you could say. But anyway, as these attacks began to occur in these areas, many of these settlers began to drift into these Moravian villages. And here are some pictures of some of visuals of things that were occurring in these areas at this time. Here's a attack of Delawares or Munsees on, looks like defenseless people as usually depicted. And we were the most violent ones, of course. But that's not really the way it went either. We're going to get more into that next time. There's another one attacking a settler's home, taking a defenseless woman. And that happened, but these defenseless women weren't killed like we were killed. And here's and like our women and children were killed. We didn't do those types of things. He was one of a number of people attacking a settler town, I suppose you could say. And there's another picture of just what it might be like. Bunch of guys out trekking through the woods on their way to do what they got to do. So anyway, this is kind of the settlers that are moving into this area. According to Zeisberger's own descriptions, they weren't the cream of the crop. These were some of the most low-life people you can imagine, the dregs of society, apparently, who couldn't buy or get land in any other way other than to go and squat on it and hope that they could fight off the Indians for it in some organized way. They began struggling into these missions that we talked about as these raids continue on. These settlers began struggling into Bethlehem and Nazareth in particular, and by the end of 1755, 300 of these settlers had joined the Bethlehem and Nazareth Moravian missionaries. And these are the same people, the same settlers who just not long before had accused the Moravians of being allies with the French and Indian lovers. And now they were placed they were having to seek help from them, as well as the Indian converts who lived there as well. So it's kind of, like they're calling us and the Moravians horrible things and doing horrible things to us. But when our help is needed, they're right there and we give it to them. At least some people do, the ones with the Moravians anyway. And there were no attacks on these villages during the war, which is interesting to note. The Moravians did try to put defensive measures in place, but it wouldn't have taken much for 100 warriors on horseback to come through and destroy these villages if they wanted to. But for some reason, being with the Moravian missionaries and their Indian converts, there was some protection given to these settlers as well. And like I say, it wasn't all settlers, just random kill whoever you come across. I'm pretty sure these were targeted, and there was a lot of good people who were left alone, as we will kind of see, because if you take a look at some of these maps, like this one here, of Zeisberger's travels, and this is a typical map of a path. It looks like the path from, I don't know, somewhere down in, somewhere anyway in this area. But you can see Indian villages along this path, and as well there's a lot of white settlements also. And there's a lot of white settlements that seem to have been left alone, or at least individual families and people, like that blacksmith I mentioned. It wasn't all just random, like I said, kill whoever you want. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that next time. But in December of 1755, 50 provincial cavalrymen, men on horses, and the former Governor Hamilton and Benjamin Franklin set out for Bethlehem, again, the village, the Moravian village on the Lehigh River here. Benjamin Franklin and former Governor Hamilton set out for that location. And while there, Franklin conceives of an idea of building a number of forts, which he eventually does. And by January, it's noted that there are 556 refugees at these missions. And in February, it's noted by a man named Redhead, or Crosswix, an Onondaga speaker. He tells William Johnson that he would use all means to pacify the hostility of the Delawares. Redhead advises Johnson that it's the failed policy of the Pennsylvanians towards the Delawares that was the cause of all this behavior in 1755, and that Pennsylvania must pay proper attention to the Delawares to keep the chain, the covenant chain we've talked about, strong. And in April of 1756, Governor Morris complains to Johnson that the Delawares from Kittanning and further west on the Ohio were the most mischievous and continued to murder and destroy our inhabitants. And around this time, eastern and western Delawares, again, we've been talking about that. The eastern Delawares are those Delawares located in these areas along the Susquehanna and Delaware River still, and especially up north towards Tioga and mainly Munsees, I would think. And then the western Delawares, who are located mainly on the Allegheny and Ohio rivers. Between the two of these, what are becoming known as eastern and western Delaware peoples, they are able to get a force of some 700 warriors together as part of the threat that they have towards the English. And at the same time, in April, Governor Morris proclaims war on the Delawares and offers scalp bounties of $100, 150 pieces of 8 for males over 12, and 130 pieces of 8 for males under 12. And again, these are scalp bounties. And we've talked about scalping, and there's mention and observations that Munsee-Delawares did scalp people in some of these raids. And there's this suggestion that we had kind of invented scalping, but as mentioned also, this was something practiced back in the early 1600s by the Dutch, taking heads and then scalping. But it's also, I've looked further into this, and it's something that appears to have actually been practiced in Europe long before it was practiced here. So, now it's so bad that they're offering scalp bounties for our men and women. And although not many of these scalp bounties are really collected, it's not like individuals are going out searching for anybody they can find to get their scalp. They probably wouldn't have much chance doing it that way. It's really an incentive for groups, militia, for instance, or groups of vigilantes to get together to kill people to get their scalps, and they do this in certain situations. There was a high reward put on the head of Shingas, who became known as Shingas the Terrible, and as well as a man named Captain Jacobs, who we're going to talk a bit more about next time. And as well, Governor Morris urges the citizens to take action into their own hands, again through vigilante forces and those people that are killing friendly Indians. The government just turns a blind eye towards. So things are starting to get kind of bad. Shingas and Jacobs lead war parties out of Katanning, and this includes Susquehanna Delawares and Munsees from Wyoming and Paxtang and Shamokin. And then Franklin builds Fort Allen, Fort Norris, and Fort Franklin. And there's some pictures of these forts just for your information. Fort Allen, kind of interesting fort. I don't know how big it is. It's not that big. And also, I believe this is Fort Norris. Not totally sure, but I think it is. Interesting square fort. And this apparently is Fort Franklin on French Creek. Franklin builds these forts, and it kind of gives these refugees in the Moravian villages a sense of relief, and they start to go back to their homes. And I have homes in quotation marks here because, you know, is this really their homes on stolen land that Delawares and Munsees are now trying to take back from them? Around this time, again, the Moravians become significant players in a lot of events that are going on, and one of the Moravian leaders named Spangenberg actually goes to Philadelphia and suggests that important chiefs be sent to Wyoming to see T.D. Escone and to again begin to talk peace with the Munsees and Delawares. And there's a man named Captain Newcastle, who's the son of Queen Aliquipa, who we talked about a time or two ago. Him, Captain Newcastle, and a man named Jagria, who's a Mohawk, and William Lacquie, a Delaware. They join a man named Augustus, and that's the George Rex I've referred to earlier as well, and Zeisberger at Bethlehem, and talk about the idea of peace. They then return to Philadelphia to talk further with the governor, and that causes Governor Morris to issue an armistice for the Delawares that are east of the Susquehanna, so that any Delawares, Munsees east of the Susquehanna now do not have to fear that their scalps are worth any money, apparently. And then Newcastle goes to Tioga, and he talks to the Delawares there. There's Tioga up on the top of the northern branch of the Susquehanna River. He goes there to invite the Delawares to come to this place called Easton, which is here on the Delaware River, at the forks of the Delaware River, the Lehigh and the Delaware River, this town called Easton, for the first of many conferences that are going to begin to occur to get the Munsees and Delawares to begin to think about siding with the English. So we've done a fair amount of damage, getting, I don't know, I'm sure people were just not happy with the way their lands were taken and maybe sought revenge in certain ways. But like I say, I think it was targeted, not random. There's certain reasons for doing certain things that I'm going to get into more next time. But anyway, oh my goodness, it's been an hour and 10 minutes. Tried to shave these down to half-hour episodes pretty soon. Getting a little long. But once we get through this tonight, maybe I'll start looking at shorter episodes, half an hour, quick, to the point. But anyway, I'd like to thank everybody tonight for hanging in there, those that have, and I'd like to say Lapishkanao Aloma. And we will see you next week to finish off this French-Indian War in the next week or two. Then, like I said, I plan to take a break till the beginning of January. And then we'll get into some of these day-to-day, just what was life like for people and what did people do and how did they interact with each other and all these things that seem to be missing from this chronology of events that we've been going through. So, like I say, Lapishkanao Loma, and we'll see everybody next week. Anishik. If I can figure out how to get out of here again.